Wordsworth. It'll be every bit as interesting, if not more so, than what I'm speaking about, probably less dry. So let me just try to encourage you all to show up. There'll be questions at the end of this. We can go on for a bit. I have nothing else to do, and I suspect some of you don't either. So without further ado, let's start with this. So we're talking about social capital. This is a subject which Don Cohen and I wrote a book about. And we both learned a great deal about the subject. What is it? It's the value and benefits inherent in social relationships. The value and benefits inherent, latent in all social relationships. This applies to individuals, it applies to communities, and many people think it applies to nations. And we'll talk about each of those three groups concurrently. The idea was first put forward by one of Helen's heroes, Alexis de Tocqueville, in Democracy in America, where he talked about this very interesting and somewhat unique position of America that he found, where people developed dense networks of mutual assistance and aid. It was a remarkable thing to him, because it certainly didn't exist in France, which was having class warfare even after the revolution. The idea hung around for a while, and then it was given rebirth by French sociologists in the late 19th century. We do not have time to go into who did what and wrote what, but take my word for it, they began to discuss it. It also was sort of quiescent for a while, and then Jane Jacobs, who was a wonderful human being, and wrote about the value of street life in New York City when Robert Moses proposed to bulldoze some of the best streets in the city out of existence. And she talks about the networks and mutual aid in these neighborhoods that would have been bulldozed out and that was irreplaceable. And she developed a whole movement. She didn't use the word social capital. She used some similar words, but that's what she was talking about. A little further than that, the subject began to perk up. People like France, Pierre Boudreau, a very famous sociologist, wrote about this thing. American sociologists and then political scientists jumped in. Robert Putnam at Harvard was one of them. In the middle of this, Don and I wrote about it. When we wrote a book about social capital in organizations, we were both researching how knowledge worked in organizations and began to realize that knowledge and the way it works, how it flows, how it's developed, is much more successful when you have high social capital. And it was true for societies too. So we did a great deal of reading and wrote this book, which I'm happy to say, if you don't mind, sold over 20,000 copies. The word became part of the social science lexicon. Some very well-known academics in business and other disciplines began to write about it. And it became a somewhat accepted term in the lexicon of terms used by political scientists, less so like economists, but some of them wrote about it. Certainly sociologists, people who are writing about urban life. So it became a rather useful subject. And it took off. I mean, there are hundreds of books about this and literally thousands of articles. If you look at the Wikipedia entry, which I did previous to this talk, it's like 4 or 5 pages with a large amount of citations. So let's delve into what, at a lower level, what exactly is social capital? Well, it's a form of capital. Capital really just means something that's invested with an expected return. It's not the same thing as money. It's not the same thing as land. We buy our homes, all the people on this call, more or less, not so much as capital, maybe somewhat, but more because we want a nice place to live. When you invest money in stocks, it's financial capital. You expect a return. When you put money, financial capital, there's other forms of capital we could get into. But social capital is having social relationships that, whether you do it intentionally or not, have a return. Most of us do this, if not consciously. We go to certain schools, we live in certain areas, we join certain associations to get a return. I dare say, without any sort of ill will or any in the slightest, that joining First Parish is a form of social capital. We expected a return of friendship, of mutual aid. Well, it is. Of joining strong networks. There are really, there's a remnant of people who don't believe this is a real subject. Many of you know I can't resist telling little stories. I'll just tell two of them. I was once sitting down in Martha's Vineyard, of all places, listening to a chamber music concert and looking at some of the proofs for the book Don and I were writing, the chapter proofs. And a very tall man was looking over my shoulder, sort of reading what I was reading, which astounded me because it's not a common subject. And I turned to him and said, "Gee, are you interested in this?" And in a really deep voice with a Brooklyn accent, he said, "Well, it looks like bullshit to me," which really hurt me. And I was about to say something nasty. And then I realized, oh God, it's Robert Solow, who had won the Nobel Prize the previous year in economics. So I said, why do you say it's bullshit? And he said, because you can't measure it. Well, there's a lot of things in life that can't be measured, trust me, that are real. I mean, we certainly talk about that in church. And just think about love and piety and patriotism and helping one another and altruism. So, but it has been resisted by some people because it's not measurable and in a very exact way, though people can measure their networks. There are really three components to social capital as we're talking about it: loose and strong networks, trust, and reciprocity. Networks are probably the strongest. You almost could say that social capital is built on one's networks. And networks are people, well, a very quick way of defining them is if you see someone across the street and call them by their first name, they're part of your network. And there are loose networks. I mean, you go into Lexington centers, it's certainly true for me and probably many of you. You know, people say hello to you. They're not all great friends. Sometimes, in my case, growing older, I don't even know who the hell they are, except they call me by my name, or they even know the names of my kids, and I don't know who I'm talking to, but that's for another day's discussion. We could talk about that another time. In any case, strong and loose networks are the strongest basis of social capital. They're not all of it. A really important element is trust. This is another part of the social science lexicon that was never spoken about or rarely spoken about until maybe 30 or 40 years ago. And then once again, a great number of social scientists began to say, well, a lot of things don't happen without trust. Many things get held up because of a lack of trust. Trust is perceived activity. If you say, I'm going to go to the store for you, you trust the person to do that. If someone at work says, gee, if you help me with this, I greatly appreciate it, and I'll help you sometime. There's all sorts of assumptions baked into trust. And if someone breaks your trust, it's asymmetric. You can trust someone for 20 years, but suddenly they do something and you don't trust them, and that's it. After 20 years, it's blown apart. So when you mix trust with networks, you begin to have a sense part of a community, part of some grouping that becomes your social capital. And yet there's a third part, and that's reciprocity. You expect people who you have social capitalist relationships to reciprocate. You help them, they help you, in barring circumstances. It's not so much trust, it's actions. Those are the three most sort of bigger components of social capital, and individuals have social capital. Let's talk a little first about individuals. The United States, we live with two tremendous myths, which I suspected were myths when I was younger, and there's no question I think they're myths now. One is universal opportunity equality, that somehow a kid born very poor with a single mother in some crappy neighborhood is just like Jared Kushner. They have equal chances of success in life. If you believe that, you're really crazy. It really makes a tremendous difference who you're born, where you're born, who helps you, far more than talent. Now, this is sort of the dark side of social capital. Social capital can increase inequality. Rich people's kids are very rarely not rich. There's been some big studies done. This has not always been as true as it has been in the last 20 years, but we've really stalled in this sort of thing. Well, that's the flip side of it. If you have good connections, your kids will have good connections. Your friends have good connections. If you have wealth, You can sort of buy connections in some ways. Why do people are so anxious to get their children into certain schools? I remember I had a close friend in high school that went to Harvard. There's nothing against Harvard, trust me. But at Christmas break, he came back and we talked about what we were reading. And we were reading the same books, more or less, King Lear and some similar history books. And I began to wonder, well, what's the difference? And then he told me his professors were all teacher assistants and research. They weren't the big names. I just scratched my head, and so did he. He said, well, why do people go bankrupt sending their children there? What's the difference outside of physical beauty? I mean, nice campus and stuff. We couldn't figure it out, but I've learned since then, clearly. It's the connections you make. Didn't help my friend. He did fine without it. But generally, those sort of connections, although people don't mention it as much, it's building social capital. But you have to want to take advantage of this. I'm going to tell a story about the late Al Jacobson, who was a very close friend of Don and I, but he told this story a few times in a public settings, and we put it in our book. He got sick of academia, so he went to Stanford Business School, become more of a manager or an executive. And it was a very great deal of money to him to go there. And he took it very, very seriously. Al was a serious guy when it came to his studies. He studied. People on his floor, on his married dorm floor, were quite a bunch of good athletes. And Al was a very good athlete. He said, why don't you come and play tennis? It's beautiful. Let's go golfing, all these athletic activities. And he said, are you kidding? This is costing a lot of money. Let's all study all this stuff. And he never did it, although he could have. He was, again, a good athlete. Well, he told me a few years later, he got a job at the Bank of Boston, and virtually nothing he learned really helped him in the job. It helped him get the job, presumably, but he didn't really use what he learned. One of those guys on his floor was Scott McNeely, who founded this firm, Sun Microsystem, and gave wonderful executive jobs to all the people who golfed with him and played with him at school. So Al told me, and he told others, he said, I thought those guys were jerks, but after 10 years, I realized who the jerk was. He used a stronger word than jerk. I'll just leave it at that. But it's a true story. I mean, you have to be open to having social cap and using it. If you don't use it, you might have it. But it's like money. You can keep your money in a mattress. It really wouldn't be capital. You can invest it intelligently, and it's capital. You get a return. You have to take action with it. It doesn't just sort of happen to everybody. Someone just said I'm muted. Am I muted? Can you hear me? Yeah. Well, sorry. I don't know what that meant. Anyway, many of us, let's take a look at the leaders of this country, some of the leaders on all sides. I'm not being partisan. Supreme Court justices. Try to figure out, how did they get these jobs? There's certainly some of them surely don't seem to be geniuses. I mean, how did they get to where they got? How do CEOs, of whom I have met a fair amount, how did they get these jobs? They don't seem particularly smart. A lot of this is social capital, taking advantage of it. It works the same way money works. You invest it well, you get a return. You invest social capital well, it gets a return. It's also important to think about social capital in organizations and in communities. I don't exactly have a lot of time to do this, but in organizations, there are strong networks and there's strong trust. Some organizations have very high levels of trust. Don and I both worked for NASA as consultants for quite a few years. Very high levels of trust. They wanted to get the mission. They wanted to get those rockets up and out. So they really did have very high levels of trust and reciprocity and a very high social capital, and it was a wonderful organization to work for. Neither of us would have stayed as long as we did without that. We then, both of us, sorry to drag you into this, Don, worked for IBM, which was nothing like that. People didn't trust each other. The networks were somewhat strong, but it was exclusionary networks, not inclusionary. They were also helping each other. Gee, help me and I'll help you, and we'll exclude other people. IBM's not doing too well these days. Social capital helps knowledge to move in an organization. People trust one another. I don't mean the knowledge in Wikipedia, but the sort of knowledge that really helps you do your job that's not always documented. Tacit knowledge, implicit knowledge, stories that help you do your work without being documented or written down. That passes through networks, but the networks that have trust in them and reciprocity are really powerful, and it's the root the way the virus takes roots, it's the root, the way this knowledge flows. No question about it. We've documented that in all sorts of ways. Even CEOs, many of them get that way. I remember meeting some guy at a wedding who someone said, oh, that guy was CEO of General Motors. I was astounded. The man was very unprepossessing in conversation, not only in looks, but in conversation. He had nothing much to say. I said, how did this guy get to run General Motors? And someone said, he just said yes to everything. He did everyone's bidding and slowly rose up, and he was trustful. He wouldn't repeat things. And he got to the top of one of the big companies in the world. Someone once said the worst form of poverty is not having connections. And that's very true. And you can give people wonderful educations. You can give them all sorts of opportunity, but having no connections makes your life much, much more difficult. That's not true. There are people who overcome this. Like some people I know, some people you might know, but it makes it much, much harder. Some people intuitively know how to act. Sonia Sotomayor was such a person. Without connections, through talent and gumption and an intuitive way of how to get ahead, she got ahead, and she did very well for herself. But generally, the benefits are really very clear. If you're good at this in communities, in organizations, in your personal life, you can use it the way you can use financial capital. If you're not good at it, you're going to have a much tougher life. Social capital does have some drawbacks. It can also increase inequality. It can replicate inequality very strongly, as well as close doors against capital, against talent. Remember that values are more important than any of these things. If your organization or community or as an individual, if you have values that are empathic, that care about others, that you try to do the right thing, stuff we talk about in church a lot, you don't need as much social capital and you don't have to use it in a way that excludes others. This is just a tool. It's a very important way of understanding what happens to individuals, in organizations, and to some degree countries. One of the people in another talk said, well, Robert Putnam has done a lot of research on social capital in countries. It's very debatable because it's almost, how would you measure the social capital in the United States? It would be virtually impossible. It's in communities, but in the whole country, you could try it with Denmark, which is homogeneous, and the Scandinavian countries, they look out for one another because that's all there are. There's very few foreigners. There's very little testing of it. And it works. There's enough wealth to go around so they don't feel inequality. So 15 minutes, that's what I could tell you about social capital. That's all I was given. I could give a whole class about this, and people do. But this is what you're getting. So if you have, thank you, Brenda. My wife's applauding. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them if you think I can answer them. Are we unmuted? Sarah, can you unmute the mics? Oh, Cammie, you have a question?
Yeah, I was wondering what you made of the, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
I was wondering what you've made of the college, admission scandal of the last year. How did you sort of put that through your thinking about social capital?
Well, it was like a shortcut to buying social capital. I mean, if you really do want a shortcut, if you don't have enough connections or you feel your child is Jared Kushner's father gave the Democratic Party $4 million to get him into Harvard, and it worked. So it's an easy shortcut. He could afford the $4 million, probably didn't matter that much to him. It was like a quick shot. He got into Harvard, built a few networks, and it worked for him. He married Ivanka, and it worked for him. It obviously should be illegal, and it's a shame that Harvard does such things, but I'm not singling them out. MIT, Bob Gibbons does not do this, but many, many schools, I guess they need the money, do things like that. You can take shortcuts. It's revolting, but you can do it. My friend got in on talent, that guy mentioned.
Then when you get caught, does that wreck your social capital forever?
No, I think it increases it.
Really?
Yeah, I do. She lives in a Hollywood, upper class Hollywood community. They'll probably think she was very clever.
Wow.
We don't know.
Can you think in your experience of one company that stands out in your mind as having increased its social capital? And what policies did it?
You know, Jim, that's very interesting because you would be a good example. When Hewlett-Packard got started, you and other friends of mine told me what a wonderful place it was to work. You, Dilip, Arthur Fox, because the founders' values were still in place. Trust, reciprocity, strong networks. And you guys all said it was a wonderful place and it was productive, innovative, a really very good organization. Once they gave it to the Wall Street type,
You know
the
that?
finance people,
She was the pastor
killed
of
it.
the church.
That's my view.
Yeah, so you're a living example of, you saw this in action.
Yeah.
She was the pastor of the church.
Somebody's talking who's not muted.
Alice, did you have a question?
Yes. I heard Larry Putnam, or Robert Putnam, sorry, talk one time and say some new research that he had conducted showed that in communities with greater heterogeneity, there was lower social capital. In other words, the more homogeneous a community was, if you were in the middle of Iowa, for example, with very high percentage of people from, German immigrant background, there was very high social capital, and the more diverse you got, and he was talking about Cambridge, Massachusetts, the lower the social capital. And I was really interested in that finding. I lived in Cambridge for many years, came to Lexington, and I do sense a difference. So I wonder what your observation is on that.
Well, Putnam's a professional researcher, and I don't have those tools or methods. It's not something I do. It's probably true, although Lexington is fairly heterogeneous. It's not homogeneous. I mean, I don't know. It's somewhat, it's a large.
Right. It has much greater homogeneity than Cambridge would.
Yes, I'd have to say that, obviously.
Let me jump in on that one, even though I'm not the speaker, because I worked on a book with Putnam, and one of the cases I researched was two churches in Southern California, a megachurch and an Episcopal church that was also large. Both those churches formed small groups. In the megachurch, their aim was to bring people together who were as like each other as possible, sometimes at a very detailed level, like the parents of incarcerated youth. The Episcopal Church, their aim was to bring together people as different as possible because they thought that mixing was very valuable. And what they found was, or what I found was, looking at the two groups, the groups at the Episcopal Church did not last because people were different. And the groups at the megachurch of people who were so similar in their backgrounds and concerns were just absolutely solid. And you just couldn't drag those people apart.
Yeah. Well, it seems likely, although I think that we should.
Fascinating.
I think we should fight against that in our lives. I mean, now I'm talking personally. I think we should, we try very hard in the church to get people in of different backgrounds. It's not easy. It's really not easy. But I know Anne and Helen both tried to do this. And we all try. I don't think we should give in to the darker angels of our sure, it's easy to hang around with people similar, even if they're not the same ethnicity. I mean, there's people, I have plenty of friends in Lexington who are different backgrounds than I, but cognitively were similar. And there is an interesting, very interesting studies done recently on cognitive plurality. In other words, not having people with the same bag of mental tools working on a project. That if you have people with different bags, cognitive diversity, that's what it's called, you can look it up. If you have people with different bags of tools, an engineer, a project manager, an MBA, maybe a PhD in systems, you get a much better output than 20 MBAs who all have the same tools. They all think alike. It's just pointless to have so many of them. consulting firms who made a fortune putting out many people, just MBAs who know the same thing, are now breaking up into putting in people who are diverse. Diversity in general is a better, I mean, if you can make such a grand generalization, is a better tool for having better outcomes. But that's sort of I can't really prove that. Although that book on cognitive diversity does sort of prove it.
Raise your hand.
David Rose.
Well, just Larry, you hinted at some of this, but maybe in the environment we're all living in now, where we understand viruses in new ways, they're part of the connectivity. The more connected you are, the more endangered you are.
That's true.
So I just wondered if you could talk about the vulnerabilities that are special to highly connected people, in not medically, but social capital.
I think there are. I think you know, there's no question, and this has been researched unto death, that people in tight networks tend to think alike. Even if you enter with different views, slowly it erodes and you join the herd. I mean, this is, I think Plato talked about this. This is, I mean, it's really an old idea, but you know, people have to find things to write PhDs about, and they write about this. So, and that's a real danger. You know, you hang around with certain people, you begin to think like them, or there's pressure to think like them. I remember I've been in organizations where great pressure was put upon me to say that systems, technology systems, could manage knowledge. That somehow you could actually manage knowledge, which is just not true. I knew it wasn't true. But I felt a lot of pressure, and it really gave me agita to have to go home and start worrying I have to defend something that to me seemed very clear and obvious. So yeah, it is a real danger. You're right. On the other hand, people got emotional satisfaction, they got job security. So it's a tricky thing to work with and live with, though we all live and work with those ideas. There's a, you know, if you're an economist, at some schools, you can't have different views. It really doesn't work well. There's sort of a set agenda. In physics, there's a standard model. And unless you're Einstein, it's hard to disprove that. You have to go along with that. So there are epistemic domains that have certain boundaries to them. And it's really tough if you try to break those boundaries, even if you can argue fairly clearly. So you're right, that's a big danger. Maybe not as bad as the virus, but not good. David Beauvais.
Hey, Larry. Talking about measuring social capital, there are some measures, aren't there, that you've talked about, and what are they, and what do they show, either over time or across different countries?
You mean in countries?
In countries, yeah. Or groups of people, or you know, how do you?
There's a study done in Michigan every, I think, 2 years, where they leave wallets with money and an ID card on the street, and they see how many of them are returned. It sounds funny, but it's not a bad measure. You can guess who comes in top and who comes in bottom. I don't even have to tell you. We all can guess, but they do it every year. There's not much change. The U.S. is in the middle. I guess it depends where in the U.S. you drop.
Right.
I would think that would have a big role. And some countries, you know, are very poor, and you could say, well, they don't return the wallet. But on the other hand, these people, some of those people are starving. They find their wallet. What do you think they're going to do? But generally, the same countries come out on top and come out on the bottom. That's one. There are kind of people who try to measure networks in countries. That's a very difficult thing to do. You can measure networks in a company. That's really done. It's done. There's all sorts of people who study that. There are journals, whole journals devoted to network studies. There are people who have chairs of network studies. And that's not hard to do. Who would list the top 5 people you go to if you had a crisis at work? List the top 5 people you go to get an answer to a very complex question you don't know the answer to. And you aggregate that, and you can do a network diagram. You can show it. And then how tight these networks are, how loose they are, who's central to the network. People use that to determine maybe who the company should try to keep and retain or even promote, rather than people all the way out on the edge who rarely are part of any networks. And, well, they don't really provide much value in the sense of sharing. Jack Welch, who had a lot of things wrong with him too, but he was very careful of saying what ideas did you spread when he evaluated executives? He asked them, who did you spread your ideas to? Name 5 people I can talk to who you gave them some of your ideas. That's a good way of measuring a type of social capital. So people don't always use the word social capital for obvious reasons, but it's a real thing. You can measure parts of it. Measuring trust is hard, as you could imagine. That's a difficult one. It's a real thing. It's like measuring love. These are hard. We live by them. Measuring the return on children. There's one that's a hard thing to measure. On the other hand, we do it. So we invest in these children. It's something along in those categories, I would say.
Thanks.
Well, if there are no more questions, I stuck to the 35 minutes that Dawn gave me. And I really enjoyed it all. It's nice seeing all my friends and people who could be friends and talk about social capital. That's what we all have in the church. So thank you very much, and tune in next week for probably a more interesting.
Thanks, Larry.
Thank you, Larry.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thanks, Larry. Larry, you've left us speechless.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thanks, Sarah.
It was
Great.
wonderful. Thank
Thanks.
you.
Sarah. Bye, Larry.
So long, buddy.
Bye.